Okay. Well, thank you very much. Today I've wanted to talk with you a little bit, since you guys are essentially preparing the people for the future, talk a little bit about the future, the mega trends that are taking place, as well as the intersections, essentially, of where these business trends are going with the technology trends and the new value that's possible and how it might change our thinking for the future. So I think I've got about 40 minutes, so I'll just get started and run through this as quick as I can. Drivers, as I mentioned, change is one of the things that is sort of taking place everywhere. It's going all around us, and it's driven by a few things. Now, these happen to be a list of areas that I happen to evaluate technologies on. So, for example, what's its effect on the visibility? Does it allow us to see things in new and different ways? And of course, ICT has a big role in addressing all of these. For example, in the mobility space, it allows us to access information in new and different places, allowing deeper engagement at the time and wherever we need that information. It allows for greater efficiency in how we look at things and greater flexibility in how we address problems around us. Of course, security and mobility is a big issue, but security is something that is becoming much more prevalent in how we think about our world going forward. So it's going to be a big driver of change in the coming coming weeks and months. So anyway, these drivers force us to change. It's not something that we really have a lot of choice on because they're sort of basic human measurements, characteristics that force us to move forward. When I talk to people about trends and where things are going, one of the things that we talk about is this concept of megatrends. These are sort of fundamental, basic things that are forcing organizations to look at their environment differently. They're relatively industry independent, and they can intersect in interesting ways. If you look at some examples of these happen to be some that no, we got to get this back. These happen to be some examples of these megatrends that I've thought about, and these can be categorized into a number of different categories. That's what these colored topics are. These happen to be from Futurist magazines, but you can lump them together so you can think about them cohesively. Because what's important going forward is that organizations look through these and think about the technology changes and what's going to happen. So some of these, for example, is the trend that we are going to live longer and have healthier lives. One side effects of that, of course, is that chronic becomes normal, because if you're healthier, you still have these ongoing problems that need to be addressed. Another one is that bandwidth becomes a measurement of distance. It's no longer how far away you are, but how much bandwidth you have that makes it feel far. So you have somebody living longer, you have bandwidth as distance, and yet a need for better education. So distance learning is one of the likely outcomes of that. And you get into these massively multi-student programs that Coursera and those kind of things are sort of an outcome of that. You could actually predict that these things were going to happen. At the same time, you have all these megatrends forcing organizations to change. You have these technology trends as well. I view that we're essentially in a world of abundance on the technology side, because based on how most systems are written, most of the systems that are out there today were actually written with a scarcity model. You never had enough data, you never had enough computing power. It was always a scarcity approach to approaching and adding value. Well, what we have going forward is essentially unlimited data with mobile devices and sensors from a variety of things, whether it's GPS or sensors that we put on our body that measure blood pressure, temperature, those kind of things, and also derived data. The fact of where data came from and who's accessing it is adding a significant layer of data that we've never had before. You have on the networking side, to transport that data, you have things like 4G and now discussions about 5G wireless. for very high bandwidth no matter where you are, and inside a data center, multi-gigabit networks to transport that information around. And then even on the interrelationship side, you have social networks that we've never really had to the same extent that we have now. So this is essentially unlimited connection capability. On the computing side, you have cloud, which probably everybody here is familiar with. At least there was a few sessions yesterday related to it. That's bringing significant computing capability to work on all this data. And then you have mobility and distributed processing as well that's coming into play. And even on the application side, the intellectual property side, you have virtually unlimited capability. If you've ever talked to somebody with an Android or an iPhone, they'll have the statement of, I've got an app for that. Well, then what they're saying is that I've got intellectual property that I can bring to bear on this problem, and with that is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. With open source, software as a service, those kind of things, it's actually shifting quite extensively how we think about solving problems. But at the same time, with all this abundance, there are some things that are fundamentally scarce. Human attention span. I mean, ever since we've been called Homo sapiens, we've had essentially a physical limit, pretty much, on how much information flows we can take. That's called the Herrera limit, or 7 plus or minus 2, that I can have 7 streams of information coming at me about. Some days are better, like on a Monday morning, maybe not 7. You can have a bad Herrera day. But the fact that it's actually a limit on, because it's not like a normal limit where, okay, I've got to my Herrera limit and then this new thing comes in and I can't take care of it. It's that new thing comes in and I'm totally incapable of doing everything I was perfectly capable of doing a second before. It's a threshold and then a meltdown, essentially, in the way our brains work in that regard. So context becomes very critical in understanding how to present information, how to automate things, and that is an example of limits. And then security, of course, is another limit that we're all probably familiar with. Well, this scarcity issue is going to be critical in defining the workforce of the future, because it's that interplay with abundance and scarcity that drives innovation. So work is going to be increasingly collaborative, as I mentioned before. There's going to be much more of a view of, instead of automation with machines helping people, it's going to be much more of human-augmented automation, where much of the work is actually all the things that are well understood are automated, and then you begin to use the people to take those anomalies and turn them into opportunities. That's a whole different kind of a working environment than what we're used to. Andrew McAfee from MIT wrote a paper in a short book about 2 years ago. It's called The Race Against the Machine. And I actually viewed it a little slightly differently than that. It's more of a race with the machine. It's us working together and creating this new work environment that is different, because one of the things that is coming out of this, as we begin to understand how to do pattern recognition and how to do analytics in new ways, is that we're beginning to automate many of the knowledge worker activities that people had to perform in the past. So that separation of normal from unique is going to be a game changer in the workplace, because frankly, most of people's, significant amount of people's efforts, I should say, not most, but significant amount of people's efforts is actually spent messing around in normal. And frankly, not all processes need people messing around with them. So if you can begin to automate it and change that so that you can focus the people on the areas that really need that creativity, they're going to have a differentiated workforce and a differentiated company. And a good example of that, I would say, is that middle management. Most of what middle management does today can be highly automated, because they're checking checkers and checking boxes and that kind of thing. And frankly, these were some of the most productive people of a few years ago. And now they're stuck in this relatively normal environment. So I would fully expect that to be part of that shift going forward, and get those people focused more on creative activities that require their expertise. Now, one of the other things that's interesting, though, is that there are actually laws that you can use, quote-unquote laws, that you can use to predict what's going to happen, because much of what is taking place is following a well-defined path. Everybody's probably familiar with Moore's Law, which is about increasing transistor density, which in the process lowers costs, as well as, more importantly, lowers power requirements along the way. Well, you can take a few of these laws and begin to extrapolate out to what the world's going to be like a few years in the future. And the example that I like the most has to do with in the healthcare space. In 2020, there'll be about 7.6 billion people in the world. Each one of those people with a well-defined standard, you could store their genomic information in about, I think it's about 2 megabytes, somewhere around that space. Well, in 2017, that would cost about $140 million to store that much. By 2020, that'll actually be down to about $25 million. But the chance of you getting all the genomic information of everybody on the earth is 0. But there are companies like 23andMe and others that are really trying to gather this database of genomic information. And let's say they are successful and get 1%. That means you could store 1% of the genomic information of everybody on Earth in about $250,000. Most businesses probably could afford $250,000 for something as valuable as that, because it can fundamentally shift an entire industry like healthcare. Today, healthcare is based on statistics. People who have these kind of symptoms probably have this kind of disease, and you respond and you treat it in this kind of way, and here's the side effects that some of them likely have. But what you can shift to is a much more of a personalized approach with people with your genetic makeup who have this set of symptoms are really likely to have this disease, and this treatment is the most effective and has the least amount of side effects. That's a radical shift in how we think about medicine and the way things work today. It's not based on generic statistics. It's based on people like you, and taking personalization, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to a whole other level than what we're probably used to. So one of the things within HP we talk quite a bit about, though, is that abundance, using that abundance of computing and abundance of storage, and approaching business value generation in a whole new way. And we usually talk about it as a new style of IT. There really is a new style of business. As I mentioned, most of the systems were based on a scarcity model that are in production today, and almost all of those are what I would call systems of record. The SAPs of the world, the financial systems, the HR systems, etc. They keep track of transactions. Who got hired? Where did you ship stuff? That kind of thing. Very important to businesses, but maybe not all that friendly to people. So in the past couple decades, there's been a whole focus around systems of engagement. And recently with the advent of the mobile phone, it's looking at where are people and how do they interact and how can we get this information to them so they can make better business decisions. Because that's frankly what all this stuff is about, is making better decisions going forward. And then you take it to the next level is what I call systems of action, which is instead of just having systems of record and engaging people, just take care of it. If you know how to handle it, cause the action to take place. We take the latency out of how the enterprise responds in a significant way, and that will differentiate the organization going forward. Once again, that's a whole other kind of education approach that's likely needed to support systems of action than just the traditional systems. So rather than talk about this strictly from a theoretical perspective or dancing around, I'd rather get a little bit more grounded and use a couple of models based on business activities, these 5, and using the approach that science fiction author William Gibson, I'll paraphrase him because I don't think I got the quote exactly right, but it's the future's already out there, it's just not widely distributed. So I'll talk through a few examples of where these technologies are being brought into play. And the first one is around the edge of the enterprise, the edge of the business. That has changed quite radically in the last few years as mobile devices have come about. We're all familiar with mobile phones, but then you also have the advent of RFID and near-field communications and things as much as your home thermostats now many times can be accessed remotely. You can control them remotely and do that kind of thing for automating your personal life. And so that's allowing you to think about the edge of your personal life as well as the edge of the enterprise in a whole different way. So, and why is this possible? As I mentioned, Moore's Law, being able to put more transistors, more intelligence in more places, that is why it's possible. And then what do we do with that? And one of the examples of where I think an industry is thinking about their problems differently is something that's relatively straightforward as potatoes. They have smart spuds is a concept that has been in production for a couple of years now. But where right out in the field they'll throw a potato-looking sensor. It's obviously not a potato, but it's because you wouldn't want it to get mashed in the process. But it's a sensor that you can throw into the process, and then it goes through and gets transported to the factory and rides through the factory intake process, and of course gets pulled out before the actual processing. But what it allows is you to look at the process from the potato's perspective, which is quite different than how most process improvement takes place. And where they've been able to implement that, they've had about about a 2-week period where they've had to deploy this. Obviously, they're deploying it in probably the worst case scenarios, but where they deploy it, they've had a 70% improvement in reduction of loss. Because you can recognize where the potatoes being vibrated too much, where are they left in the sun, where are they left in human environments so that they rot. Those kind of things make a huge difference in a little sensor pack. The same things happening in the poultry industry. And then actually I did a blog post last week related to sensing on the skin, this sort of temporary tattoo approach to gathering information. This one happens to be based on gathering temperature information, which as you go into the flu season might be pretty useful. But then you can get an even more interesting example of something that this is out of University of Washington, a prototype for, where you can notify people who have diabetes of their blood sugar level. Because that's a pretty catastrophic thing you want to know about right away. But it's a contact lens that could get the sugar levels off the fluid off the front of the eye and sense and then notify the person. Obviously, this is very early prototype, but I think actually this one's only been used in rabbits. But it's still an interesting thought process of what you would do and where this kind of information would be so critical. So we're talking about gathering significantly more data than what we've ever gathered before. Essentially an unimaginable amount of data, if you will, out of this Internet of Things. And you add on top of that the metadata, which gets back up into this information up in here, the social information about who's talking to whom, about what, who's gathering it. We actually had a project out of HP Labs a couple years ago now called Compass, where we were taking the information that's, if you're familiar with SharePoint, which is sort of a data repository kind of thing, what kind of information were people putting into the SharePoint site? What kind of information were people sharing in their email with others? Because one of the problems that every multinational organization has is, where is the expertise? HP's got, I don't know, 340 million or 340,000 employees or some crazy number like that. Where the heck do I go for this answer? And how do I keep from overwhelming that person? So what this project was doing was looking at people's behavior and gathering expertise. Because there's 3 ways really to get people's behavior, or people's expertise. One of them is to self-identify, which is what most companies do. Hey, I'm an expert on whatever it is, PowerShell. Another one is based on who actually publishes information that might be of interest. And then the third way is, where do people go to get information? If you know all 3 of those things, you have a real deep understanding of where the expertise is in that organization. So that's what we were trying to flesh out. And of course that is based on having huge amounts of information, much more than we're probably used to dealing with before. So let's go on to talk a little bit about this whole concept of taking this information and doing something useful with it. Moving from this latency-rich sense and respond approach to a much more proactive cause and effect view of what's happening, why is it happening, and what can we do about it. That's where I get into that whole automation discussion before, and having the power to predict what's happening. This system here happens to be a system we did for a municipality in California that was taking, what we do is gather the information from all their emergency response systems, their fire department, police department, ambulance, whatever it might be, even utility trucks, that kind of thing, and put it all in a database, which was quite useful because the people could have this situational awareness, the leadership could have this situational awareness and get at it from wherever they were in the world. In fact, the first time they had to use it, the mayor and all those folks were on the East Coast, and there was a big fire that swept across, and they were actually able to monitor what was going on across all these systems remotely. But what's more interesting is taking the metadata about this and being able to put rules around it. So for example, and this is just an example, if 4 police cars are in the same location, say within 100 feet of each other, and it's not a donut shop, it's probably something that the chief of police needs to know about, because it's not a normal thing for those police cars to be congregated in that way. Or say 3 police cars and 2 fire trucks, or whatever it might be. So we put rules in place to identify unusual events and then notify the people to take the latency out of them responding so that they don't have to sit and monitor scanners or whatever it might be all day long. They can get it notified on their mobile system. So that's sort of this whole predictability, situational awareness, and you can probably think of numerous examples of industries and government entities that are really into situational awareness that would benefit from that. Because what we're talking about here is really shifting how we think about data, because frankly most people don't make decisions off data. At best, they make decisions off the context that data describes. There's a whole other philosophy that all decisions are emotional and we justify it with data. But so what we're talking about here is trying to get what we used to call, or what we call the right six, the right information in the right place, in the right time, to the right person, in the right format, and most importantly, driving the right result. Because if you don't get the right result, all the rest of that's a waste of time. So taking all these systems that are gathering all this information and applying an intelligent approach to get that time to value down. Understanding how to get value more quickly is where all these systems are headed going forward. And of course you have the 3 V's, the volume, velocity, and variety of the data flow that is causing organizations to sort of reassess their whole approach to IT. At the same time as you have all this data, you also have these conflicting issues. People want their systems to be mobile and yet powerful, secure and yet collaborative. These competing views and competing expectations. And anytime you see a conflict like that, that's an opportunity for innovation. And so that's, when you're talking about things like low cost and yet high quality, how would you do that? What are the attributes that you can address? One of the things we were talking a little bit, I was sat in one of the sessions yesterday and they were talking about IT roles in Northern California. And one of the things I mentioned is, what is abundant up in Northern California that you could maximize the value of what's scarce? Because they wanted to get more employment and that sort of thing. So they seem to have a very loyal workforce because people want to be up there. Of course, it's very beautiful up there. There's a variety of attributes about it that are in great abundance. How can you find out what's scarce, which is jobs, and maximize that? Because when you have these conflicts, and you can identify it, what's interesting about the future environment is that it's an and world. People want to choose among things, not between things going forward. And so there's all kinds of opportunities to take advantage of that. And there's all kinds of techniques as well. Gamification is an area that I did a whole bunch of work on a while back, related to, my definition for gamification, by the way, is metrics-based, rule-oriented behavior or goal-oriented, I should say, behavior modification. Because what you're trying to do in almost any gamification effort is you gather all kinds of metrics about what people are doing, and then you figure out how you can make adjustments so that people behave in the way you expect. Some people would think that's fairly manipulative, but on the other hand, if you do it right, it's the people's idea that they want to take that and adjust their behavior accordingly forward. And so there's all kinds of great examples of gamification. Education, of course, is one of the areas. I think Florida in history has a whole gamification curriculum, gamified curriculum around history to encourage people to not only just learn what's required, but learn much more by interacting with others and you know, internalizing it into their view of the future going forward. So gamification is an example of that organizations are using to extend people to learn more. A great example that's like in Salesforce.com, they have a whole gamification approach that looks and says, okay, based on your behavior, you're performing at this level. Well, people at the next level do these other kinds of things. So they start to expose them to these other kinds of things, and then naturally they'll increase their abilities as they move forward. So I'm sure you guys have much more experience and interaction with gamified concept than I do. But that's part of why the concept is so powerful, is because if you do it right, people sort of internalize it and take the changes on. Another thing on the personalization front that's very important is this whole issue of bring your own device, which to me actually has very little to do with devices. It's much more to do with access to corporate information in particular on the corporate side, but also the policies, both the HR policies, the financial policies, all the policies that are in place that enable that access to information to perform new things. Because one of the things that you're trying to do is, the people are trying, the employees are trying to do in many cases, is use that information that on their mobile device or whatever it might be to make better decisions and move forward. At the same time, though, what you're also seeing is not just devices that are coming in, but more of a bring your own service, whether it's backup services, storage services, sometimes even email services. It becomes much more of an environmental problem, a holistic environmental problem, than just related to any particular device or any particular architecture going forward. So that's another thing that I think organizations are having to deal with is they thought it was one thing. It's sort of like the elephant in the four blind men. They thought it was one thing, but as they got closer to it, they saw these other attributes about it, and that's shifting about what people need to know about. And I think one of the things that you guys all have quite a bit of experience with, because I was in some discussion yesterday about soft skills and that sort of thing, is much of what you have to do is prepare people to learn new things. Because anything you learn in the technology space today is going to be obsolete probably in 6 months to a year. So how do they take on these new things and understand the context of where they fit together? And that's where this whole issue of what I've been calling Enterprise 3.0 comes into play. Because it's about a holistic view, all the way from the sensors to the networking side to the analytics and the data intake, the analytics, et cetera, and finally getting to the action at the end of the day. What we're talking about is utilizing this network of capabilities to in this interaction to provide new value, like I was talking before about the Compass project. As these things interact, as this data gets consumed, what do we know that we didn't know before? And that allows you to, as you begin to automate, et cetera, get to a negative response time. Because one of the interesting things is to get to a zero response time, which we've talked about for decades, is very, very expensive. It might actually be cheaper to get to a negative response time where I can predict what's going to happen and skate to where the puck's going to be, as Wayne Gretzky said, rather than wait for something to happen and then try and respond as quickly as I can. Because that's just very complex and frankly too expensive for most organizations to handle. So one of the other interesting things, though, getting back to what's happening today, is we have a very good example of where that's been applied to significant impact, and that's actually in cloud computing. These concepts of taking all the data that's gathered and being proactive and moving things forward has been taking place for quite a long time. I mean, what we used to have is that if a system went down, a disk drive went down, whatever it is, we used to beat 50 people. And where only one person, let's say, could do something about it. So we interrupted, as we've learned over time, that people aren't really multitaskers. Anytime you interrupt with them, they really do have to reboot and get back into the context of what they were working on. So before we beat 50 people and interrupt them from whatever they were doing. Over time, we got better, be able to take in some of the information a little better, use things like the calendaring system. Well, these people are not here, so why would we beat them? And these other people are in meetings, why would we beat them? They can't do anything about it anyway, as well as skill sets and stuff. And so we get a little better, and we use alerts to collect and analyze and focus on what's happening. And then we get even better, and we begin to isolate the critical issues and just get the people who could actually do something about it involved. And then now the cloud space is being much more proactive in the less critical things, the things that you can sort of see are headed south. Then you begin to get the people involved, or you automatically substitute disk drives in, for example. If it looks like this dry farm is getting a little low, well, we'll just move a few over there and work through this little crisis and move them out a little later, or in the computing space. Well, now what you can see is these same techniques can be applied to almost every business process that's out there. And that changes how we think about how people are employed and what they'll do in business processes. So, and I call this Enterprise 3.0. Unfortunately, Enterprise 2.0 was stolen by those social guys. So, and it's sort of a categorization of some of the ways that you look at these things differently, going from a very hierarchical to a much more network, self-assembling approach to the enterprise, much more holistic. The concept of mass customization also comes into play, that you organize the environment to the situation of the moment as opposed to the situation that is like in the healthcare space, statistically the best situation. No, statistically the best situation is not good enough. We want what is good enough right now. And that's this whole Enterprise 3.0 kind of perspective. I just noticed I have a little bit of time. I want to just touch on in the mass customization spot. Earlier this year, I put together a 3D printer. I created one, pulled it together, and printed out a bunch of stuff. Definitely not something that's ready for mass market, I would say, at this point. But it's an interesting example of this mass customization process, in that most of the things that I've made were actually things that broke for other people. One guy, he had a set of drawers, and he had it for 10 years, and this little hanger on the back broke, and he didn't know how to get a new one, so I made him a new one. Or a hanger for a monitor for the camera that clipped on. That was another one that I made something for. And what is interesting about that is, when we talked before about this and versus or kind of world, is that 3D printing is a good example of where that's headed. And I doubt that it's going to catch on in a wide range for quite a while, but you definitely see the stakes in the ground along the road of people beginning to use these things to customize and identify solutions to problems that, frankly, the mass market could never address. And so that's an interesting thing going on here, because many organizations, many businesses, you might have seen, there was an announcement, jet fighter from the UK that flew, I think, yesterday with 3D printed parts on it, and a variety of other things. It's becoming much more prevalent, and that's going to change, once again, both the what we think is possible, as well as how we can identify value going forward, and also reduce the waste essentially that's created, because anybody who's been to an after Christmas sale knows that we produce quite a bit more than what the market can consume in many cases. Well, since I'm in California, I figured I'd talk a little bit about sustainability and the whole issue of IT's role in sustainability. Because one of the things that's interesting, at least to me, is that during this downturn in the economy, a lot of the CIOs get an almost exclusive focus on cost reduction. And I'm like, well, IT was never brought into businesses as something to cut. It was something that would differentiate their organization and generate new insight and perspective of what's going forward, because it's one of the things, particularly with all the data we're talking about gathering, that you can get this holistic view of what's going on. So that just means to me that we're spending our IT dollars in the wrong areas, or at least spending them ineffectively, particularly when 80% of most IT budgets are consumed by the just keeping the lights on, consumed by the fixed costs associated with IT. That's a big issue. But it's also, I think, a big opportunity to think about where can smart be applied, smart techniques be applied, and shift what is the resources that are consumed. So before, I spent a lot of time talking about the resource being the employee's attention span, but then you also have all the other resources in the environment itself. One of the interesting things, since HP is one of the things that Enterprise Services does in particular is provide cloud computing services. One of the things that we've been an example of taking something that's what you would think is very stupid and adding some smarts to it is essentially lighting. The lighting in our data centers can sense where the people are, and if there's no people there, the lights are off. If the ambient lighting comes up through skylights or whatever it might be, then the power consumed by the lighting goes down as well, because there are techniques now that you can provide dimmers essentially to fluorescent lights as well as LEDs, incandescents, etc. And so you can begin to put the smarts in there so they can recognize what the environment is, what's the context of the situation, and then shift accordingly. And so that's all kinds of opportunity for IT. Well, I wanted to finish up with just a few thoughts. Because one of the things that is important when you talk about it, most futurists view the future as being this lovely future that is calm and quiescent, and then when you get down into the details, you realize it feels more like this, that there's this big storm turmoil going on. But on the other hand, this is not something that you just have to wait for the future you get. You can actually predict what's going to happen to some degree, read up what's happening, and you can plan for that future that you want to have instead of the one you end up with going forward. So I wanted to leave on just a few summary points out of the presentation. One is that there's many factors that are going to enable change, but it is predictable at least to some extent. So you can plan to take advantage of those things that you can predict. Scarcity affects value. Determine what you have in abundance, and then what is scarce, and just figure out what the relationship is between them. That's an important factor in any kind of planning activity. The rate of change and transformation is increasing. We need to prepare people to assimilate and take advantage of change. One of the things, a little analogy that I sometimes use related to change is, if you think about change, historically we've thought about change as a disruption of the status quo. There's something going on, there's a little bit of change, then we reach this other plateau, etc. But now we're talking about change that's much more of a continuous situation. Change, which requires a different skill set. And the best analogy I could use for that is if I were a home buyer and you were a realtor, and I said, hey, I want a house. First thing you talk to me about is the first 3 laws of real estate: location, location, location. And I'm like, wait, I want a flexible house. Location is my problem, not your problem. I want something that I can move down the road, get to where I want it to be, push out the walls to have the kind of environment that I want to have, possibly even flip down the back and have some other mode of transportation associated with it that I can drive around and get the kind of gas mileage I need once I get there. I'm talking about a motor coach, not a house. When you think about that, there's a whole different skill set associated with a motor coach. You're not talking about a civil engineer or a static structural engineer that does that kind of work. You're talking about more of a mechanical engineer, somebody who can put wheels on something, somebody who can understand the stresses that are taking place at that point, and they can shift how you think about providing that flexibility into something that actually will work. So that's part of what we have to go through as we think about this continuous change process, is that the skill sets are actually a little bit different than what you might expect. The other thing is that you have this increasing digitization of society, commerce, personnel, et cetera, that's not going to replace the processes and systems that are in effect today. Those systems of record still need to be there, but you're going to supplement them to add whole other levels of capability and value. And finally, that social influence, the fact that everybody's talking to each other and we're sharing information in real time about what's going on, is going to impact every organization. But you can make it work for you if you actually keep tabs of what's going on and try and influence it in an effective way. So anyway, that is my presentation. I want to thank you guys for asking me to be here. and I'll take questions if we have time. Sure, I'll take questions. Come on, there's got to be some question out there. Something that people are waiting to ask.
I've got one.
Okay.
So,
well, one of the things I was in a little bit of a discussion yesterday is on the soft skills side. The fact that when you have a very dynamic environment, it's who do you take with you and how do you take them with you that's going to be critical to those who are successful. And unfortunately, that has little to do with technical expertise. That has much more to do with the soft skills side. In fact, I did a discussion in Dallas, and one of the educators said, but wait, all the standards that I'm living with are saying to take out the English skills and that sort of stuff, and so that's not part of the curriculum. And I'm like, well, what prevents you from adding it to your curriculum? If you know they're going to need it, why not have them fail in a safe and relatively safe environment? And you can point out the changes that are going to be required along the way, then to have them get into the workforce, and I understand that they're unemployable. Well, there's some interesting thoughts that have to go through getting back to that abundance and scarcity side. Of course, you talk about getting rid of things like programming languages. Assume that the students can figure out what programming languages do and how they work. And then you have the whole issue of, well, but all the COBOL programmers in the world are retiring, and there's almost no way to educate themselves on COBOL. So there's some counterplay there. But it gets back into, are you in training or are you in education? Because if you're talking about training kinds of activities, in most cases, well, definitely in a 4-year curriculum, you just assume that the students are going to figure that out. 2-year might be a little bit different. They probably need significantly greater hand-holding to get through those technical issues than otherwise. But I would say that's part of it, is think about what's training and what's education, and focus on the education side, because that's what they're going to need to do over the life of their career. Not that I'm an expert on education, by the way.
So we live in a society that values a 4-year degree more than what the economy is offering. Is there any way we can share with your employers
Of course, what's interesting is that most of the universities have realized that that's a big gap, and they're doing much more project-based work, particularly in their senior years going forward. Because I help with University of Texas in Dallas on one of theirs, and what I do is give them a project every semester of some nature that. But one of the issues that you have, at least it's talked about quite a bit in the Dallas area, is the cost versus value of a 4-year education. That cost seems to be spiraling up almost exponentially, and yet is the value going up exponentially as well. Where with a much more of a 2-year degree or a technology-related degree, that value is many times short-term, and then you're essentially bootstrapping the person so that they can, if they want to extend out their education or their career, they can do that using other techniques. So I don't know that it's shifting, but it's definitely being talked about quite a bit, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Sure. Oops. One more. That one.
Information representation.
Yes. Well, are you familiar with the concept of semantic networks and semantic knowledge? It's much more of a relationship among things in categories than, say, keyword search. When you're doing what most of the internet search is, frankly, keyword search oriented, but with semantic, which is sort of like what I was talking about before with the Compass project at HP Labs, what we're doing is, what is the context that this document is in? I don't care about the particular words that are in it. What is its context? And how does that relate to the context of the individual? Because then you can begin to say, okay, this person's writing a document. Oh, it looks like this document's about such and such. Hey, did you know that 3 desks down, there's a guy who wrote a white paper on this about 2 years ago, blah, blah, blah. How can you take latency out? And that's sort of that whole thought process. Okay, looks like I'm out of time. I'm getting hooked.